Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Peter Bergen of the New America Foundation. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to this event. We're going to talk about nuclear weapons in a changing world. We have three absolutely stellar speakers. We're going to speak in the following order. Joseph Cirincione, who is president of the Ploughshares Fund, one of the world's leading experts on nuclear weapons, director of the Non-Proliferation Program at Carnegie for 8 years, a long-time professional staff member of the Committee on Armed Services in the House of Representatives, teaches at Georgetown, the author of Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. Then we're going to go to Vipin Narang, who's an assistant professor of political science at MIT, a Marshall Scholar, an MPhil from Balliol at Oxford, postdoctoral fellow at Belfer, and many other such qualifications to be speaking here today. And finally, Trita Parsi, who's the founder and president of the National Iranian American Council, the author of Treacherous Alliance, a key book on the secret dealings between Iran, Israel, and the United States, published by Yale. He's going to be coming out with a new book in January called Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, which will be published by Yale in January. He's worked for the Swedish Permanent Commission of the United Nations, frequently published in places like the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and a guest on CNN and other well-known media organizations. We're also publishing today by Mr. Cirincione this paper, Strategic Turn on the new U.S. and Russian Views on Nuclear Weapons, and he will talk about some of the highlights of that paper, and I'm going to turn it over to him now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure. I have an hour, is that what you said? to talk. Well, I'd like to thank New America for hosting this and for graciously agreeing to publish this paper. I'd like to thank the Coca-Cola Corporation for sponsoring panelists. Not really, but they should. But they should. And thank you all for coming today. It's a real pleasure to have an audience like this to discuss these critical issues with. I'm just going to take 10 minutes to sort of talk about the themes that the New America Foundation asked me to develop in this paper, and then sort of set up the other panelists on this. And we start with a discussion of the U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals because they have most of the nuclear weapons in the world. It is actually somewhat silly to think that you can discuss issues of nuclear proliferation, nuclear risks, and nuclear dangers apart from the discussion of what the U.S. and Russia are doing with their weapons. 95% of all nuclear weapons in the world are held by the United States and Russia, and there is a profound shift underway in these two countries on how elites see the security value of these weapons. 20, 30, 40 years ago, nuclear weapons were seen as the core of both countries' security strategies. We went a little nuclear nuts in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and amassed very, very large arsenals. Between the two nations, we had about 70,000 nuclear weapons at the height of the Cold War in the 1980s. We have steadily declined since that time, starting with the negotiated agreements spearheaded by Ronald Reagan and the Soviet leaders at the time. We've climbed down. We've cut over 70% of the arsenals. There now are approximately 20,000 nuclear weapons held by the two countries. They have moved. The security elites have changed their views of these weapons from seeing them as core security assets to peripheral assets. They still see them as important in their national security strategy, but they are of declining utility, which is why you see the U.S. military, for example, strongly endorse the efforts by the Obama administration to develop a new nuclear posture last year, to negotiate a new agreement with the Russians to reduce nuclear arsenals on both sides. They just see them as less and less relevant to the security threats of the 21st century. And this is a view shared by security elites in both Republican and Democratic parties pretty much across the board, including former secretaries of state and defense, such as William Perry and George Shultz and James Baker and Melvin Laird, all of whom endorse the views that we have to steadily reduce these weapons and move towards their elimination. Views that used to be the child of the political left in the 70s and 80s have now become the views of the center of the American security establishment. The center has shifted. Arms control is the new realism. Every place that is, except Washington. In Washington, this debate is highly politicized. Reductions in nuclear weapons, treaties with other countries on nuclear weapons, approaches towards stopping the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries have become spears in the political debates. So you saw the spectacle last year of the Republican leadership in the Senate opposing a fairly mild arms control treaty that was endorsed by every senior military leader in the United States serving in positions of authority, and by most of the retired military leaders who have been in charge of U.S. nuclear weapons policy. You saw the Republican establishment in the Senate oppose the advice of the military leadership in and out of office on this relatively minor treaty, basically for political purposes. Just today, or just this week, we're reminded of how this debate has become politicized by the publication by Mitt Romney of an article on his blog citing this New START agreement, the arms control agreement approved last year by the Senate, as evidence of President Obama's inexperience in office, that this was a foolish agreement, shouldn't have been negotiated, shows that Obama is basically appeasing the Russians, giving away the store. That is not the view shared by the majority of the security establishment outside Washington, and in part because they believe it is critically important to reduce U.S. and Russian weapons in order to stop their spread to other countries. Here's what the interim report of the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States had to say on this. This was a commission chaired by former Secretary of Defense William Perry and former Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger. The commission concluded, what we do in our own nuclear weapons program has a significant effect upon, but does not guarantee, our ability to get cooperation with other countries to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. In particular, this cooperation will be affected by what we do in our weapons laboratories, what we do in our deployed nuclear forces, what kind of nuclear policies we articulate, and what we do regarding arms control treaties, specifically START and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So what we do in the United States and in Russia on our nuclear policies matters. It influences other countries' decisions on whether to acquire these weapons or not. It influences the kind of cooperation you can get from your allies and your friends in order to stop those other countries. This is a long-held view in the American security establishment. It is not true, as some now allege, that it just doesn't matter what we do. We can do whatever we want. We can maintain however many we want. We can slip in and out of treaties. It doesn't matter. False. False, and the U.S. security establishment has repeatedly found this to be the case, going all the way back to some of the first proliferation intelligence assessments done by the CIA. A good example is the first recommendation to President Johnson by the Kilpatrick Committee back in the 1960s. Measures to prevent particular countries from acquiring nuclear weapons are unlikely to succeed unless they are taken in support of a broad international prohibition applicable to many countries. In other words, if you want other countries not to acquire nuclear weapons, all countries have to steadily be reducing and moving towards the elimination of these weapons. I'm going to end by just giving a specific example of how this works concretely in efforts to convince Iran not to acquire nuclear weapons. U.S. and Russian cooperation on Iran has been significantly enhanced by U.S. and Russian cooperation on strategic nuclear weapons. You can see it. There's a direct corollary in action here. U.S. and Russia have different views of the Iranian problem. The U.S. sees Iran as a threat that must be confronted. Russia sees it as a problem that has to be managed. But but neither wants to see a nuclear-armed Iran. It is not in the strategic interests of either country. They have had various views of how exactly to deal with this. It's gotten quite testy at times, particularly at the nadir of the U.S.-Russian relationship in 2008. But we've seen, particularly with the twin policies by President Obama, to one, reach out to Iran and offer to engage Iran, thereby showing who the problem was in this relationship, thereby reducing the threat that the U.S. would take military action against Iran. That has had an impact on Russian view of our intentions in the region. And by improving the overall U.S.-Russian relationship, we've seen Russian cooperation on Iran improve markedly. Instead of opposing U.S. sanctions resolutions in the UN Security Council or watering them down, we've seen the Russia become a key partner with the United States in passing these resolutions, a key partner in trying to arrange the nuclear fuel swap with Iran in 2009, although that deal ultimately didn't happen. And we've seen Russia take steps that were against its own economic interests, for example, canceling the sale of the S-300 air defense missile system to Iran to further bring pressure on Iran and to comply with the UN-passed resolutions prohibiting military sales to Iran as long as Iran is not in compliance with its non-proliferation obligation. This is something that cost Russia billions. It was a real sacrifice that they had to make, but they're doing this as part of what they see as the in partnership that's developing with the United States on this. How will that ultimately affect Iran's calculations? I'll leave that to Trita to answer, but it has certainly affected international perceptions of U.S. intentions on nuclear weapons, and therefore done exactly what the experts said it was. It's improved cooperation. We have more cooperation on sanctions on Iran, on isolating Iran, than we ever had, in large part because countries do see this as a common standard that's being applied, not identifying and punishing one particular nation and holding them to a standard that we don't apply to ourselves, that we don't apply to our allies. So if you want non-proliferation, you have to be moving towards disarmament. That is the central lesson of U.S. and Russian policy, strategic policy over the last several decades. It's what the U.S. security establishment now believes is the most effective way to proceed, and it's a principle that we're going to be debating and arguing about in the political world here in Washington during and after this current presidential campaign.
Thank you so much, Vipin.
Thank you, Peter and Cheryl and the New America Foundation for having me. What I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about the view from Asia. And Joe accurately described, I think, the move and the shift and the emphasis on nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union, not Russia, and the United States, from core to periphery. But I think it's important to remember that Asian countries may still view nuclear weapons as a core part of their security. And I'll talk about three key features of the Asian nuclear dynamic involving Pakistan, India, a little bit on China, and then put some meat on the bones by talking specifically about each of those three countries. So the three features that I think are salient from the regional nuclear powers in Asia, South and East Asia, are first, that the era of states relying on nuclear weapons for their day-to-day security to deter conventional conflict is not yet over. And the most obvious example here is Pakistan, which relies on nuclear weapons to deter its conventionally superior nuclear-armed neighbor, India, potentially a U.S. Invasion as well. The second key feature of the emerging nuclear landscape in Asia, which is captured in the South Asia and Chinese dynamic, is the multipolar nuclear interactions that are starting to emerge between states that border each other, that have enduring rivalries, and dynamic linkages between their nuclear programs and their conventional programs, nuclear sharing, as with China and Pakistan. And this complicates all the misperceptions and miscalculations involving nuclear interactions that may not have been present during the Cold War. And as nuclear weapons potentially proliferate across the Asian landscape, from Israel out to potentially South Korea and Japan, you'll have an alleyway of several nuclear states which border each other, which have historical alliances and enmities, which complicate the interaction between these states, and you throw into the mix nuclear weapons. The third key feature is that a lot of these states may have weak domestic institutions, may face internal threats, may have complicated civil-military relationships, and I call, encapsulated in the Asian dynamic right now, is what I call the Goldilocks problem. In Pakistan, you have too much military. In India, you probably don't have enough military. China may have it right, but down the road, it's unclear whether the civil-military relationship in China will remain as stable as it presently is. And emerging nuclear states will continue to face these problems, both within their institutions and also potentially domestic threats. So in the context of external multipolar interactions, there's the additional complication that these states have internal problems as well. So I'll put some meat on the bones, these three features, by talking about the three states that have empirically constituted the South and East Asian nuclear powers. I'll start with Pakistan. The U.S. and Russia are concerned with trying to establish stability at low numbers. Pakistan's core aim is to establish instability with low numbers, primarily to deter an Indian conventional attack, and potentially after, if U.S.-Pakistan relations continue to deteriorate, potentially rupture, there's no question that the Strategic Plans Division of the Pakistan Army would think about how nuclear weapons might fit in their security vis-a-vis the United States as well. But the fundamental role of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal is not necessarily to deter an Indian nuclear attack or nuclear attack against Pakistan, but to deter Indian conventional power. The memory of the 1971 war in which Bangladesh was birthed off of East Pakistan still sears in the Pakistan Army's memory. And so Pakistan's nightmare is a repeat of the 1970 war that tries to finish the job, so to speak, and split Pakistan in two, either at the hands of India, which was the traditional envisioned adversary, but the United States as well increasingly is viewed as threat number one. And nuclear weapons are central to Pakistan's day-to-day security in this scenario. And Pakistan's nuclear program is expanding at a faster clip probably than any other state in the system right now. There's the active uranium enrichment program and the arsenal, which was developed since the A.Q. Khan years in the late 80s through the 1998 tests. In addition, however, China is helping Pakistan develop a plutonium pathway. It is now building four reactors plus a reprocessing facility in Pakistan to expand the plutonium arsenal of Pakistan's nuclear assets. And across the range of theater to strategic nuclear systems, Pakistan is rapidly expanding its arsenal and its delivery capabilities. Most recently, Pakistan has tested the Hadaf 9, or the Nasser 60-kilometer delivery system, which it envisions being used in a theater scenario against Indian conventional forces. This is a response to India's so-called proactive strategy options, or cold start doctrine, which I can talk about later in more detail. But the idea here is to give Pakistan credible options at the lower spectrum of use options against Indian conventional power, while at the same time expanding its strategic nuclear assets at the higher range delivery systems to target Indian cities, to deter an Indian counterstrike in the event that Indian conventional forces operating on Pakistani soil. Pakistan's nuclear planners seem to be envisioning a scenario where they would use nuclear weapons to blunt an Indian conventional attack, potentially with theater or tactical nuclear weapons, and then rely on the strategic reserve to deter an Indian counterstrike against Pakistan cities. And so Pakistan's nuclear requirements are not necessarily driven by India's nuclear requirements, but also India's conventional posture, which is expanding and modernizing very quickly with the assistance of the Russians, increasingly the French and the United States. And if you're Pakistan, this is not an irrational nuclear posture or position to have. After all, this is exactly what NATO did during the Cold War, relied on nuclear weapons as either a tripwire or as the threat of early use against Red Army breaches into Western Europe to deter a conventional conflict. But the problems in Pakistan, which are different from the Cold War, is one, the proximity between India and Pakistan is much closer than the United States homeland and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which means that warning times and miscalculations and misperceptions would be much greater. Early warning systems in both countries are not as sophisticated as the U.S. and Soviet Union architectures were. In addition, you have a fissiparous regime and army, and I don't even think the latter institution, whether the Strategic Plans Division or the Pakistan Army or Air Force itself, is monolithic. We've had some disturbing developments over the past 15 years, not just in the past several years, but you had the attempted Major General Abbasi coup in 1995 against Benazir Bhutto, who his aim was to Islamicize the army. Most recently, you had the arrest of Brigadier General Ali Khan, who was linked to Islamic extremist groups. And so, the concern that the army, the officer corps in the army may have potential internal threats which could compromise the security of nuclear assets remains. And this complicates command and control in a potential crisis with India, where Pakistan would have to devolve assets and authority down to the core level in order to credibly threaten nuclear use against Indian conventional forces, which generates not just a single red line, which is, everyone talks about Pakistan's red line against India or the United States. The problem, it seemed to me, might be in a potential crisis that you would have several red lines as these assets were devolved to lower level commanders. And so you could have the possibility of inadvertent or advertent nuclear use at lower levels than the nuclear command authority in Pakistan would anticipate. The second problem in Pakistan, which I don't think is unique to Pakistan, which may travel to other potential future nuclear powers, is what I call nuclear weapons-enabled terrorism. And this isn't to say that the Pakistani state has a conscious policy of erecting a nuclear umbrella behind which it can unleash militants against India or Western targets, but just that militants in Pakistan may feel emboldened, whether they're state-sponsored or not, I'll leave that question aside, to perpetrate attacks, knowing full well that the Pakistani state would be immune from retaliation because of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal and this very aggressive early use posture that Pakistan has. So these two problems complicate the nuclear dynamics between India and Pakistan in particular, but also I think Pakistan and the rest of the world if militant organizations such as the Lashkar-e-Taiba start targeting Western assets in the region or outside the region, and how Pakistan's nuclear assets play into that strategy. With India, if the problem in Pakistan is that the military has its hands too deep into the nuclear arsenal, the problem in India is probably the opposite. The military isn't involved at a high enough level with India's strategic nuclear arsenal. And the problem here would be concerns about reliability of the arsenal and whether it is actually a credible deterrent against its adversaries. And so, this is the opposite extreme of the Goldilocks problem. And so, in a system where the civilians want to maintain very strict control of the nuclear assets, it may come at a price for deterrence, and how that complicates crisis bargaining and nuclear deterrence with potentially China in the future might be something India has to be concerned with. India is also expanding its nuclear arsenal, and I would argue that India is not immune to homegrown threats as well. This is something the Ministry of Home Affairs in India doesn't like to talk about, but it is eminently possible that homegrown militant threats in India start posing a threat to its nuclear arsenal as well. With respect to China, I won't talk too much about the nuclear modernization program in China. I think everybody is well aware of the expansion to mobile and solid fuel ballistic missiles, the DF-31 and the DF-21, sea-based capabilities. But with respect to the dynamic with South Asia, I would just highlight a couple of things. The first is China's search for survivability as it's sizing its force to U.S. missile defenses and conventional counterstrike, conventional counterstrike capabilities might create problems for command and control. One of the advantages China's had over the past 40-odd years, 45 years now, has been a small arsenal that has been able to centrally control under the direction of the CMC. But as the arsenal modernizes, as China tries to achieve survivability against primarily the United States, that might complicate command and control. And these are issues that I think the Second Artillery needs to work through still needs to work through. The second thing I would highlight is China's assistance to Pakistan. This is, I think, representative of the kind of nuclear cooperation we may see in the future with more emerging nuclear powers. China and Pakistan, the level of nuclear cooperation between China and Pakistan is probably unprecedented in the annals of nuclear proliferation. China not only provided blueprints for warhead designs, 50 kilograms worth of HEU in the 80s, ballistic missiles off the shelf with the M-series exports. There are some questions as to where Pakistan got the design for the Hadaf-9 warhead, which it claims to have. It would almost certainly have to be a plutonium warhead, which Pakistan never tested. The primary suspect for where they would get a design that might work would be China. The third thing I would highlight with China is, although there have been smooth transitions, leadership transitions in the past, given China's growth rate and all the potential social problems that China faces down the road, where does that leave China's civil-military relationship and command and control over nuclear weapons? So if this Asian dynamic is representative of future emerging nuclear powers and the problems they face, then some of the things we're thinking about and represented between India, Pakistan, and China are how civil-military relationships might emerge, the kinds of linkages between the states. So you have nuclear cooperation, for example, between China and Pakistan. China's force structure is sized to the United States. India's is kind of decoupled from China's, but at least some nuclear requirements are dictated by China's geography and force structure. And then you have Pakistan's nuclear requirements being dictated by India's conventional posture, India's nuclear posture, as well as potential threats from the United States or abroad. So you get these nuclear dominoes and linkages at the conventional and the nuclear level. So reducing nuclear armaments may not be sufficient to motivate some emerging nuclear powers, in this case, Pakistan, from disarming. I mean, it's hard to convince. It would be hard to convince the Pakistanis that even if India eliminated its nuclear weapons arsenal, that it should eliminate its arsenal because its primary aim is to deter Indian conventional power. And I think the real problem, in the emerging nuclear landscape in Asia in particular, and as other states proliferate in the region, will be these multipolar nuclear interactions and how complicated they might be, given historical enmities, enduring rivalries, cooperation between states, and how the U.S. manages this landscape given its own interests while trying to simultaneously pursue an agenda of stability at low numbers, I think will be extremely complicated. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Trita.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's a great pleasure being here. This is probably the first panel that I've been invited to speak on the nuclear issue in Iran for several months, at least since the Arab Spring. So in my naivete, I almost thought the problem had actually gotten resolved, since we haven't had this conversation for a while now. I want to talk a little bit about how I think the Iranians are viewing their region and their calculations, and juxtapose that to how I think we over here are assuming that the Iranians are thinking about their environment and about their problems. Over here, I think there's a couple of assumptions that have been made that have not been tested. Actually, there have probably been very few opportunities to test them. But nevertheless, they have become guiding stars of our policy. In fact, sometimes when you put together a policy, by the assumptions that you've based that policy on, the policy is essentially inevitable based on those assumptions. On Iran, we have made a few assumptions that I think would be worthwhile revisiting. The first one is that if you are Iran and you live in what arguably is a very rough neighborhood, and you have nuclear weapons in Pakistan, in Russia, in Israel, in India, as a result, naturally, you want to have a nuclear weapon as well. Second assumption is that as a result of the first assumption, there is absolutely no reason for you not to rush towards a nuclear weapon. In fact, there's very few ways that the desire for nuclear weapons can be reversed. The only thing that can be done is to prevent you, not by changing your desire, but by preventing your capabilities, your ability to achieve a nuclear weapon. And that essentially, I think, has been the cornerstones of our policy, and not just the United States when it comes to dealing with Iran. if you take a look at the Iranian nuclear program, and not only how the current regime in Iran, but also how the previous regime in Iran has looked at this option, how it has acted, what it has and what it has not done, I think you see a far, far greater, more complicated picture in the way that they view their environment and their options and their dangers of going down that path. In fact, you see a lot of ambiguity and ambivalence vis-a-vis nuclear weapons, ranging from the fact that the Shah himself, on the one hand, was starting a program, was very concerned about the Soviet Union, was absolutely convinced that in a conflict between Iran and the Soviet Union, the United States would not come to its aid. And as a result, was toying with the idea of, at a minimum, having the capability, but at the same time was very, very reluctant at actually going the full way of getting a nuclear weapon or testing a nuclear weapon or announcing the capability of a nuclear weapon because of other factors that I will go into in a second. Same thing is true to a certain extent during the Islamic Republic. First of all, the ambivalence, I think, is quite clear, mindful of the fact that for the first couple of years after Khomeini took over Iran through the Islamic Republic, through the Iranian Revolution, the program was stopped. And even at the height of the Iraq-Iran war, the Iranians were not pursuing the program. But it wasn't until 1986 or so in which it got restarted again. You have to be careful what conclusions you draw of these experiences, but at a minimum, I think it casts a lot of doubt on some of the assumptions we have about their unstopping desire for a nuclear weapon. Now, what were the considerations, the strategic negatives that guided both the government of the Shah and the current government to not go at this full force, to look at this in a little bit more complex way than what we are looking at it, or we're assuming that they're viewing it from over here? First of all, the ultimate Iranian objective of the government of the Shah, and to a large extent the government currently today as well, is that a key objective that they're trying to reach, beyond their own survival, is to be recognized as a major player in the region, have a seat at the table, what they oftentimes refer to as primus inter pares, first among equals in the region. This is something that goes deeper than any particular regime. It goes, in fact, perhaps even deeper than any specific state interest. It seems to be ingrained, to a certain extent at least, in the Iranian identity of a state for the last 3,000 years, have been playing a major leadership role in the region for most of those 3,000 years. That desire, however, the Iranians have learned the hard way, cannot be achieved solely by pursuing a hard power strategy of just being able to outgun all of your neighbors and as a result be the strongest power in the region. That very much was the strategy during the time of the Shah, and the Shah had, I think, the third or the fourth most technologically advanced military in the world at the time because of all of the arms sales that all the oil money that he spent on American weaponry. That did not buy Iran acceptance for its leadership in the region by its own neighbors. A sense of threat from the Iranians, a sense of arrogance from the Iranians, particularly on the Arab side, feeling that Iran was throwing around its weight a little bit too much. And the Shah was very well aware of the first strategic negative, which is that if Iran did go for a nuclear weapon, it could spark a nuclear arms race in the region, which would then eliminate the very reason why Iran felt that it did have a claim for regional leadership, which was its conventional superiority. But if you had an arms race in the region, then other states, much smaller states, could also go for a nuclear weapon, and then they would be at strategic parity. Iran's conventional superiority would not be as relevant if more than one country in the region had a nuclear weapon. Part of the reason why Iran, as a very populous state in the region, together with Egypt in 1974, introduced a resolution at the UN calling for a Middle East nuclear-free zone. The two countries that probably would lose the most if there was a nuclearization of the region. First strategic negative. That strategic negative has not changed since then. The second one is that to the extent that the Iranians are projecting a threat, which they in many ways are anyways, but to the extent that they are, by going for a nuclear weapons race, all that has done in Iran's experience is to cause its smaller neighbors to rush to one of the two, or at this stage, the only remaining superpower, and ask for military protection. And we see that very clearly with $60 billion arms sales going to some of the Persian Gulf Arab states. So instead of getting acceptance or acquiescence into what the Arab side perhaps would view as Iranian hegemony, all it leads to is an arms race in which the Arabs turn to the United States to be able to arm itself to the teeth vis-a-vis Iran. So Iran does not achieve its objective. Instead, the Iranians have gone for a middle strategy, both during the time of the Shah as well as currently, of trying to get the technology and the capability to have the option in case there is a significant deterioration of its security environment. And this is to a very large extent driven by the experience of what happened in the Iraq-Iran war, particularly how it ended. There was a conclusion, both on the Iraqi side as well as on the Iranian side, that if there were to be another war between Iraq and Iran, weapons of mass destruction would be used at a very early stage in that next war. And that was a very strong driving force for the Iranians to keep the option, but because of the strategic negatives, not go all the way unless it was necessary. What has happened in the last year and a half or so is that you're starting to see other arguments emerging in the Iranian debate. It's very, very difficult to detect them. That is changing the picture somewhat, in my assessment, in a very negative way. Because of the massive sanctions that have been imposed, because of the Iranian perception that they're unfair, that at the end of the day, if there was an acceptance of Iran's right to enrich, the whole issue could be opened up. The Iranians wouldn't have to go as far. They could make more compromises if their right at a minimum was recognized. You now have arguments emerging saying that the only way to be able to force the United States to some sort of an acceptance, the only way of being able to reach parity is actually to go for a weaponization, because it would force the United States to get serious about creating a nuclear-free zone, and it would force the United States to address the Israeli nuclear arsenal. My assessment, this is still a very, very, I want to make that clear, a minority view, but you're starting to see arguments emerging. And it's an important distinction to be made, because prior to this, you could see a very strong consensus on the idea that Iran has a right to enrichment and it should not compromise on any of its rights in that regard. You did not see a particularly strong view, both at the popular level or at the elite level, in favor of actual weaponization. You still don't, but you're starting to see some changes there. And it brings to question again that if the strategy that is being pursued is measured against the metric that their program is slowing down, they're having greater difficulty in doing X, Y, and Z, or this is, as Joe pointed out correctly, bringing the Russians and the United States in greater collaboration, it creates a scenario in which Iran increasingly becomes a principle, an organizing principle for how the United States and Russia and other major powers in the P5 interact with each other, and ensures that they're on the same page, more so than actually ensuring that there isn't an increasing desire or a pace towards a weaponization inside of Iran. If there isn't a recognition that you have to address not just the supply side of nonproliferation and the ability of states to be able to get access to technology or build it themselves, but also address the driving force for the desire to have it, the demand side of nuclear weapons, then I think we will ultimately fail when it comes to the case of Iran. And as Joe told me right before the break, part of his paper is pointing out that that is one of the most important cases in order to stop the spread of weaponization and proliferation as a whole, that we will miss that. And I'm very, very concerned about that, because the focus tends to be far too much on the supply side, and we're not picking up the changes that are taking place in the debate there, and we're not picking up that there actually are forces within the country itself, dominating forces, that don't view a weaponization as a positive thing for the Iranians strategically. How can we take advantage of that to make sure that we use it in favor of nonproliferation? Thank you.
Thank you. A question before we open up to the floor, just sort of maybe for Joseph and Vipin. It seems between Zardari's comment that there would be a no first use doctrine for Pakistan, which then there was a sort of total silence from the Pakistani military on that question, combined with some of the things you've just talked about. It seems that they're developing tactical nuclear weapons. Their concerns about India's supposed cold start doctrine. that it reminds me a little bit of August 1914 in a sort of unfortunate way. And I wanted you to sort of talk aloud a little bit about, because I mean, one of the sort of very common themes in this country is the concern the Taliban will seize Pakistan's nuclear weapons. So I think that personally, without being an expert in this area, I think that's fairly improbable. What is much more likely is a nuclear war between these two countries, which is a fairly high level of. And I wanted to talk about how you see a Mumbai 2 playing out, which seems one of the more predictable problems the Obama administration or any American administration will have to face in the next 5 to 10 years. How that might play out in terms of the conventional and/or nuclear posture.
Let me start. I think we should pay a lot more attention to that scenario. I really do think that that is the most likely scenario that would lead to the use of nuclear weapons in South Asia, and we're just not thinking it through. For years, experts have seen South Asia as the area of the world most likely to see a nuclear weapon used in combat. We have 2 nuclear-armed countries that share a common border. They've had 3 wars in the last 50-odd years. 50. Are you counting Kargil?
Let's say 3.5.
So I was just going to get to that. They after both sides had tested and begun to deploy nuclear weapons, they still massed 1 million troops in 2001 during the Kargil crisis. Sort of belying the idea that nuclear weapons would deter a war between the two countries. We came very close to one, and it required extraordinary efforts to pull the two sides apart. So the combination is very combustible, and it's there. And we sometimes like to think about these things. We're sort of stuck in World War II metaphors. Iran is Nazi Germany. Somebody's expanding this way or that way. There's a strategic plan to do this or that. But I'm much more with you. I think we should go back and reread Guns of August.
Yeah. And
take a look at World War, because I honestly believe that we're much more likely to sort of stumble into a nuclear conflict by miscalculation, by accident, rather than by strategic plan. And what we now know is that, and tell me if you disagree with this, that the ISI was deeply involved in the Mumbai attacks. So the Pakistan intelligence services were deeply involved in the Mumbai attacks, the purpose of which was to start a war. What they wanted to do was start a war. They didn't succeed. Go ahead.
Just to clarify, David Headley, was testimony, talked about a major in the ISI. And David Headley is by his own account, a professional fraud. So what he says has to be taken with a grain of salt. I'm not saying it's implausible, but I think we have to understand the source.
Okay. So do you think there was ISI involvement in The
question is, The question is, was it official ISI involvement, or was it some guy who's part of the apparatus or retired? Or not? I think those are.
And some of that is by design too.
Right.
Firewall.
So it's even more complicated.
There may have been ISI involvement. What do you think the purpose of the attack was?
To derail the back channel talks. Actually.
Sure. Yeah, and there's no. I think we can all agree on the motive. The question.
And I think they haven't. This was a very successful model for them. I think there's intentions to do. There's a great possibility they would do something like this again. And if it happens, we get right into, and here I'm setting you up, cold start.
Yeah, right.
We get into cold start. How would India perceive that attack the next time it happens, and what would their response be?
We only have a couple of minutes, right? So I'm not gonna so I could go on at length about the India-Pakistan conventional and nuclear dynamic. The first point about Zardari, I think, is important. So Zardari, I think it was 2009, was giving an interview to an Indian television program, and when asked about no first use, he said, "Yeah, sure, Pakistan can adopt a no first use policy." The next day, the army said, Mr. Zardari, with all due respect, you have no authority or right to speak about
Mr. President.
I'm sure they used other choice words. And there's that great picture of Kiani holding the stick in sitting down with President Zardari at the time. I think that's representative of the civil and military problem in Pakistan, where the civilian, even though Zardari used to be the titular head of the NCA, now it's Gilani. is this is a cradle-to-grave military program, and there is no intention of abdicating the right to first use, precisely in the face of India's so-called Coal Star doctrine. Now, with respect to Coal Star, I think the problem that India faced after the 2001 Parliament attacks was that the conventional concept that the Indian Army had developed was this 3-week mobilization of these massive strike corps that are held in India's interior, or deployed in India's interior during peacetime. And it took the Army almost 3 weeks to mobilize the strike corps, and that's the only offensive retaliatory capability that India had at the time. And so the Army was faced with a lot of organizational and bureaucratic embarrassment after what ended up being known as Operation Parakram, which is a 10-month deployment of the strike corps on the border, and there was never any offensive action authorized by the then BJP government. I think a lot of the talk of Cold Start is often described as a doctrine. I think it's better to think of it as an op plan. It's a mobilization procedure designed to more rapidly mobilize India's armored elements to be able to provide the political leadership with a retaliatory option. All of that is to say that the authority to launch offensive action against Pakistan still lies with the political leadership, and so far the political leadership in India has exercised, in my view, tremendous restraint after 2001 and then again after the Mumbai attack. So the question is, will that restraint be exercised after another attack? One argument is that the domestic political pressure for military retaliation the next time around will be too great for any political leader, even Dr. Manmohan Singh, who is probably one of the most restrained Indian prime ministers that India has ever had, from authorizing some sort of ground retaliatory options. In that scenario, the Army...
Retaliatory options against?
Well, so the one option is the airstrikes against...
Pakistan.
Against Pakistan, right.
So a terrorist attack triggers an Indian military option against Pakistan.
Potentially, right. So the Army would say, okay, we need 3 to 7 days to be able to conduct ground operations, and the Air Force and the Army, I don't think, would go in without ground options, being able to at least surge against Pakistani targets. And the objective would be to degrade Pakistan's Army and Air Force. I mean, it would have to hit the Pakistan.
So what does Pakistan do?
So then so I think this has been gamed out in India, where the potential for nuclear use is very salient. In fact, after the Bombay attacks, there was a report 2 years later about what the Cabinet Committee on Security conversation went like, and Prime Minister Singh asked, what would happen if we authorized ground options? What would Pakistan use nuclear weapons? And no one could really give him a firm answer, and I think that provided some ground for hesitation. But that's precisely what the deterrent posture that Pakistan wants to signal, which is if you do launch ground operations across the international border in particular, not necessarily the line of control, we might use nuclear weapons. But they've done it. The SPD has done a good job of signaling a red line anywhere between tripwire and last resort, right? So they wouldn't be caught bluffing either way.
Can you clarify what you mean by that?
So there are multiple signals sent as to when Pakistan might use nuclear weapons. One signal sent is as soon as you cross the international border, we'll use nuclear weapons on your concentrated armored elements to terminate the conflict. Other signals are, no, it's primarily to Western audience, last resort, we would fight a conventional conflict unless we're really getting degraded and Lahore or Islamabad or Karachi was at risk of being seized by Indian forces, we wouldn't use nuclear weapons. The problem, of course, is at least Lahore is in a built-up area. It's not that far from the border, right? So when the Indian proactive strategy concept is talking about operations 30 to 50 kilometers into Pakistani territory, that's pretty deep. If you're in Punjab, if you're in the desert or Sindh, maybe that's not as deep. But
see, the point for me is that all of this is not under control. Once this starts happening, what the strategic plans, confront reality.
I think that's right.
And there's a tremendous potential for things to spiral out of control.
The concise answer is, so long as the Indian government exercises restraint, this is under control.
Right.
But the next time around, I'm not convinced that they would be able to exercise.
I mean, my understanding is there's now some form of hotline between, which didn't exist even relatively recently. Is that correct? Do you have any?
I think there's DGMO hotlines. I'm not sure about the state about PM hotlines, but I think there's a hotline between, and I think there may even be talk of, I forget where they are with the dialogues now in terms of who has a hot, but I think there's a DGMO hotline between India and Pakistan. I'm not sure about ISI and RAW. I'm not sure about the PM. I don't know. There may be NSA hotlines too.
Well, thank you. Let's open it up then to questions. If you could identify yourself. Questions are meritorious. Long statements are demeritorious. So, wait for the microphone as well. Thanks.
My name is Steve Snigoski. I'm PhD, but never got a job in U.S. diplomacy. I just have the analogy with, I can't see the analogy with August 1914, though. Wouldn't this war be a localized war? In other words, wouldn't the major powers, their effort would be to stop the war rather than become part of the war? And yes, a few nukes being dropped would be a horrible thing, but how much would that really affect the United States and the rest of the world? Because there were some pretty humongous nuclear tests, as I recall, in the 50s and 60s, with many megatons of nuclear explosions, and people talked about this is dangerous, but it really didn't seem to kill people around the world.
Okay, thanks, Joseph.
Would you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, the relevant piece of the analogy to me is, seemingly small attack or terrorist event in India could trigger a massive response on the Indian side, where a political leadership that couldn't withstand the domestic political pressure for restraint would authorize retaliatory action. But it could start as a very small equivalent of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And I don't think that it may not be localized. I mean, if it looks like Indian conventional forces might split the Pakistani state, who knows how China might react? And India has started thinking about the possibility, has always had to worry about the possibility of a two-front war, given the historical cooperation between China and Pakistan. And I don't think the U.S. could sit idly by as this conflict got underway. I mean, you have to worry about nuclear use on population centers, and all of the American interests involved in the region would be held at risk. So I think there is a relevant part to the analogy.
Two quick points. It's quite possible that this war would not involve Europe. So what? I would say a war involving Pakistan, India, and possibly China qualifies as a world war. This is the new world we're living in, and it would be just as large and just as devastating as any European war ever fought. Two, could it have global consequences? Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no question that the use of even one or two nuclear weapons would be a catastrophe that the likes of which we haven't seen. We haven't seen. I don't mean we haven't seen since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean we haven't seen. This would be used on a densely populated, could be used in a densely populated modern city. We haven't experienced anything like that. And that would have global, international, economic, strategic implications just by that act. But it's not at all clear where the use of nuclear weapons would stop in this scenario. And if it were to escalate to a full-out exchange, and it's possible that you could get this, and you would have the use of, say, 200 nuclear weapons in the South Asian subcontinent, climate scientists have recently modeled this using the new computer equipment and tools that we have, and they've concluded that the use of even as few as 200 weapons in South Asia would stimulate a global nuclear winter. That is, the fires caused by these, particularly in the densely populated cities of South Asia, would put up enough particulates and smoke into the upper atmosphere to blanket the Earth in a cloud that would drop global temperatures about 2 or 3 degrees for approximately 3 years, that would be enough to kill most food crops on the planet, thereafter quickly followed by us. So,
Can I
so that
It would be a big deal.
So it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter if a nuclear weapon never left South Asia. It would be a global life ending catastrophe.
And can I just say one? Even if a single tactical nuclear weapon were used in the scenario where India was retaliating militarily on Pakistani soil, I think we enter a new global era, right? The taboo is gone as soon as a state uses nuclear weapons on another state in anger. And I don't think we can underestimate what that new world where nuclear weapons use has been legitimized looks like.
Can I offer just one other similarity of the summer of 2014, which is it was not just a small event that triggered the global catastrophe, it was also the tactical doctrines of the armies involved.
Sure.
So it was about the mobilization of the Austrian Empire army and the German and the train timetables. I mean, all of this was being driven by that. So that's the kind of comparison. It's the use of tactical nuclear weapons and the Cold Start doctrine taken together, which would make the similarity, I think, much more strong, in addition to the other things that Joseph and Vipin have talked about. Okay.
Any other uplifting topics?
I was wondering if you could speak to some of the implications of the rift between President Ahmadinejad and Supreme Leader Khamenei that's become more public recently on the Iranian nuclear program, particularly within that context of this ambivalence that you've described within the Iranian state on the nuclear program.
Thank you. I think on the first point of the impact it would have on the nuclear issue at this stage, I would say is probably minimal. In fact, there's probably only about 18 people in Iran that have any impact on what the decisions the Iranians are going to make on the nuclear issue. And most of them are surrounded in Khamenei's office, and there's some people from the scientific community and from the IRGC. That rift that you're talking about, that is mainly cast as a rift between Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, goes much deeper than that. But it's also a rift that was long time in the making. It's been quite predictable. From the very beginning, when Khamenei ended up taking such a strong and blatant side with Ahmadinejad after the elections, it was quite clear already then that this was much more of a marriage of convenience, this was much more tactical, and it would backfire on Khamenei, and at some point, the conservatives as a whole would try to find a way of making sure that they got rid of Ahmadinejad. But it's not just because of Ahmadinejad, it's because of the generational shift in the power structure inside of Iran that is taking place. In fact, I would guide you to a piece that was just put on the National Interest blog by Reza Marashi and Jason Rezaian, who goes quite deep into this. And this is a generational shift. You have a new generation of people who were the foot soldiers of the revolution and who are challenging the establishment in Iran, and who started off challenging the more easy parts of the establishment. You first go after the reformist. Afterwards, you can take on the centrists around Rafsanjani. Now the only people who are left were the really core conservatives around the Larijani clan and Khamenei. And at that point, it became too much. And they're getting quite severely beat back. What it is doing, in my assessment, in my optimistic assessment, is that even though I don't think one can say there's any good guys in this fight, there can potentially be a good outcome, in the sense that in the last decade you have seen the Iranian political spectrum shrink quite significantly and move very, very far to the right. But now as you have this fight take on, and it's taking on an unprecedented dimension. I mean, you have a president who has to give warnings to other power centers in Iran, saying that the red line is for you to arrest any of my cabinet ministers. I mean, this is clearly not a normal situation, even by Iranian standards. And the very intense rivalries and the factional infighting that exist over there, is that this can very well end up weakening the conservatives to the extent that we may see a reversal of the shrinkage of the Iranian political spectrum. Elements that for now have essentially ended up being outside of the spectrum may be able to find their way in. That's not going to turn Iran anytime soon into a democracy or anything like that, but it can reverse the trend that we've seen so far, in which is becoming increasingly undemocratic, increasingly autocratic, with an increasingly dominant, increasingly clear presence of the IRGC and the military component of that.
Thank you. Adam Nixon with Al Hora Television. My question, I think, is primarily for Joe. I'd like to talk about mutually assured destruction and the presence of non-state actors. And how does the presence of a non-state acting in connection possibly with a nuclear armed state affect the doctrine of mutually assured destruction? Is there a scenario where a nuclear state can see cooperation with a terrorist organization where they don't end at mutually assured destruction? How does that affect that doctrine in some of these cases?
So mutually assured destruction is a fact of the nuclear age. When you build up large arsenals against each other, the use by one side of large numbers of nuclear weapons against the other almost certainly would trigger a response from the attack state to launch its nuclear weapons, and both would be destroyed. It isn't so much a doctrine or a strategy that people thought up. It's a reflection of this is what would happen. So it's a fact of the nuclear age. It doesn't really apply to terrorists. The terrorists don't have national territories or national futures to defend. For some strands of international terrorism, the more apocalyptic or messianic strands, in fact, they welcome a global conflagration. This is what they believe is the war that will lead to the coming of something. So I'm saying this instead of you.
No, absolutely no, but I mean that's right.
And so, in some ways, it's what they want. It's what they want. So, nuclear weapons have nothing whatsoever to do with our ability to stop nuclear terrorism. And this is increasingly this is part of the thinking that's leading military officials to move away from nuclear weapons. Look at the Nuclear Posture Review. You look at the new National Security Strategy of the United States. It says the number one threats to the United States are nuclear terrorism and a nuclear proliferation, the spread of these weapons to other states. What do 4,000 nuclear weapons in the active stockpile have to do about those two threats? The Nuclear Posture Review says increasingly we're going to evaluate our nuclear posture in how it deals with those threats that we face. If you actually apply that standard, which is the struggle that's taking place right now deep inside the Obama administration, if you actually apply that standard, you would reduce and shrink the existing nuclear arsenals in order to because they have nothing to do with the threats that you actually face, and in fact the existence of them impedes your ability to deal with those new threats. That's a somewhat long-winded answer to that question.
As a follow-up to that, the barriers to entry, it seems to me as a general visitor for everybody, but starting with you, Joe, the barriers to entry for nuclear terrorism seem pretty high, speaking as somebody who knows very little bit about the subject.
And you're right.
What is a plausible,
So here's the problem.
Yeah.
Nuclear terrorism is expensive, is difficult, is improbable, but it is not impossible. And that's your problem right there. It's an unlikely event, but it's a possible event. And the consequences of that event are so catastrophic that when you apply a normal sort of risk assessment, of risk times consequences, you still come out with a sort of value on this side that means that you have to do whatever you can to prevent that from happening. So if the chance in any given year is 1 in 1,000, how does that play out over 20 years? You have to start, and this is what drives people to say that our policy has to be oriented towards preventing nuclear terrorism, towards preventing the spread of these weapons to other countries. I actually think with the death of Osama bin Laden, or the assassination of Osama bin Laden, the threat of an al-Qaeda nuclear threat attack has dropped. He was one of the champions of al-Qaeda acquiring nuclear capability. Zawahiri, much less so, maybe not have been in favor of it at all. And the disruption of the al-Qaeda network, I'm slipping into your territory here, over the last decade now has decreased the chances that they're going to do it. But it hasn't eliminated it. And while that's happened, suddenly we have Pakistan emerging, which is where Osama bin Laden was, which is where there are radical Islamic elements that have powerful military capability against established Pakistani military targets. And you start raising the concern that a new while you've been dealing with one of them, a new possible terrorist threat has emerged, and that the target might not be us. That if a terrorist element in Pakistan could acquire a nuclear technology or nuclear material, it doesn't have to be a bomb. It can be the material itself. They might use it against an Indian target, for example. And so there's a new threat that's risen even as we've decreased one.
No, I agree with all of that. The oversimplified answer is if you don't have access to fissile material is very high. The barriers to developing a nuclear weapon are very high. But if you can get access to fissile material or a workable bomb, then the barriers are very low. So the nexus is, okay, which non-state actors have access to either state resources or fissile material or can buy it on the black market. I think nuclear threat reduction, non-Lugar, have done a good job shutting down the Russian sources of fissile material. But there is the Pakistani worry. I mean, the nightmare scenario could be one of two things. One, you have a militant organization who wants to acquire a nuclear weapon, knowing full well that Pakistan's state assets are more vulnerable in a crisis with India, provoke a crisis with India, and as assets get moved, as India may be mobilizing, you steal one. That's the scenario that keeps me up. Well, there are a lot of scenarios that keep me up at night. So that's one scenario that keeps me up at night. The second is you have a genuine insider threat. There is the work by Chris Fair and Shuja Nawaz on the LET suggests that the LET and the Army now recruit from the same districts. When they say they're family, maybe the linkages are deeper than these are kinship networks. And you may have a militant organization that may get unfettered access eventually to a nuclear weapon through the state, and then whether it's used against Indian targets or American targets in Afghanistan, that would seem to be easier. Those are the worries that in Pakistan are militant organization with access to the state resources, and that's not unique to Pakistan. I mean, I think there are other states that may face this as well. Any state is vulnerable to homegrown threats. I mean, we're not immune in the United States either. India's certainly not immune. So, or Russia. So this is a global problem.
In the front here.
We haven't mentioned, I don't think, Arab Spring, or if you like, Arab Winter. I'd be interested in any speculation as to what the effect of spring or winter might have on the problem on the possibility of proliferation in the Middle East in terms of cascades or non-cascades, or perhaps nothing at all.
Actually, one place to start is with you. I don't know what your view is of this. There's an interesting article in Foreign Affairs currently arguing, and I think this is my view, that the Arab Spring it will play out to Iran's disadvantage, to the continuing demonization of the Iranian model for revolution, that the Arab people are now taking their fate into their own hands and making the kind of changes that both Al-Qaeda on one hand and the Iranian government on the other had advocated, but they're doing without Al-Qaeda and without Iran, and they're doing it in a mainly secular way, but certainly an indigenous way that sidelines and makes less attractive those models, and that by weakening the Iranians' appeal to the region actually could work towards Iran getting greater incentive to make a deal. So that's with the West, with the U.S. in particular. That's one. I don't see any indication that any of these social reform movements, government reform movements, have stimulated proliferation desires in any of the affected states. I mean, Egypt is certainly capable, could make a nuclear weapon with some great effort. Toyd, as you know, Andrew, explored this option in the late 60s and early 70s, particularly under Nasser, abandoned it. But there's no indication that they're looking at this seriously now at all. The driver for proliferation in the Middle East would be not Israel or the revolutions. It would be an Iranian acquisition of a bomb. That still remains the key driver, I think, somewhat independent of what the Arab Spring has brought about.
Again, it really depends on whether we're talking about the Arab Spring or the Arab Winter. Because when you take a look at what's happening in Egypt right now, a very likely outcome after the Egyptian people very courageously demanded their right for democracy, etc., is that it doesn't seem to be a clear outcome, but rather you will have a government and then you will have a intelligence service, and they will be pursuing two different policies, and it's going to increasingly look like Pakistan. Under such a scenario, and the impact that Egypt, as a very influential state in the region, has, the repercussions it will have regionally, and the changes that can cause to the security environment can then completely put on the question all other assumptions as to whether the Egyptians would go in that direction or not. Not to make the argument that Mubarak was some sort of a noble hindrance towards any weaponization proliferation in Egypt, but the fact that you will have a much more uncertain situation if you have the Arab Spring turn into an Arab Winter in Egypt and lead to more of a Pakistani type of a governing system. As it comes to Iran, I would tend to agree that at least in the short run, the Arab Spring is definitely going to have a negative impact, and it already has, on the Iranian appeal or the Iranian position in the region. The Iranians had long cherished and predicted that many of these Arab governments would fall because they do lack popular legitimacy. But what they got wrong, at least so far, they really got wrong, was that they expected that these popular uprisings would not just be targeting the Arab dictatorships and autocrats itself, but also targeting their American backers. So far, we have not seen that development, at least not to a large extent. These uprisings have been remarkably neutral on America, in the sense that it's not been about America. And I think that's really thrown off the Iranians in the way that they were calculating how this would happen, how they would be able to get inroads in expanding their influence and taking advantage of this. In the long run, if they are successful, if we're talking about a spring and not a winter, it would have a significant negative impact on Iran's ability to amass soft power outside of its own immediate borders. Because the source of their soft power to a very large extent has been, and I'm talking about outside of their immediate borders, has been the ability to take advantage of existing Arab frustrations, with Israel and Palestine conflict not being resolved, with the United States supporting their autocrats, with the lack of dignity, lack of democracy, etc. Under those circumstances, when you have one state, and it tended to be the only state that was willing to take a stand against Israel, at least in a superficial way, or against the United States, that did create a situation in which the Iranians were viewed very differently by the Arab populations. But if you have a successful Arab Spring, and you will see Arab foreign policies being more in tune with their public opinions, and you're seeing more than just one state that is willing to address the Israeli-Palestinian issue in a little bit more of a robust way and not just acquiesce into the parameters that is imposed on them, then the attractiveness of what the Iranians are doing is going to be significantly reduced. How that will impact any calculations on their nuclear calculations is very difficult to predict. But mindful of the fact that the soft power component has been a deterrent for the Iranians to actually go for weaponization, then one possible scenario is that if the Iranians feel that they already lost that, then a significant component for them, a significant force for them not to go in that direction may be eliminated, and we may see a new posture by the Iranians. But again, I want to emphasize that's just pure speculation at this time.
As you're passing the microphone to the next person,
Right.
let me just mention Saudi Arabia. It's the other country to watch, because they're the only country in the region that has a sort of the ability to have a shortcut to a nuclear weapon through their financing of the Pakistani nuclear program. And people have speculated that at some point there might be an invitation by Saudi Arabia to have Pakistan nuclear weapons stationed in Saudi
AQ Khan
Arabia.
had another customer. We don't know.
And AQ Khan had another customer. So Saudi Arabia is a country to watch, particularly as they desperately scramble for a new security paradigm to replace the one they believe they are losing with the United States.
By the way, we have 11 minutes left, so we're going to have to get things more expeditiously.
Okay.
Professor Narang, you mentioned the Pakistani nuclear weapons being a deterrent against the U.S., not just as India. Could you elaborate a little more on Pakistan-U.S. relations and that claim specifically?
Now, whether it will actually be a deterrent is one thing. I think the Pakistanis may increasingly believe that they have to rely on nuclear weapons to prevent an American seizing of their nuclear arsenal. This is a scenario that they've worried about and talked about in the past. Potentially, if relations deteriorate even further, again, in 11 minutes, I won't get into too much of this. I don't know where...
We don't have all 11 minutes.
Yeah, I've got 30 seconds. So 30 seconds. I don't want to prognosticate on where U.S.-Pakistan relations are going. Just to say that my own view is I think that they will be manageable, and that this is there are areas of overlapping interests. It will be a difficult relationship, and as we reduce our footprint in Afghanistan, we may have more points of leverage with Pakistan and the military in particular. But I think the Pakistani state has viewed its nuclear weapons as a successful deterrent against India, and I do think it would certainly deter an American conventional invasion of the Pakistani state. I don't think that we would ever contemplate boots on the ground in Pakistan.
Except on May 2nd.
Sorry. Oh.
Very briefly. Very briefly.
Right. Overt conventional invasion of Pakistan, or seizing their nuclear assets. I mean, I think the Pakistan military establishment thinks that that's off the table, or at least they would view nuclear assets as a core part of deterring that particular scenario.
I'm wondering if you all can comment a little bit more about Israel's relation regarding its own nuclear capacity to the U.S. interest in disarmament internationally. Should Israel, even though it doesn't acknowledge its own nuclear capabilities, be engaged by the United States, if that's even possible, in disarmament? Does Israel's nuclear capacity really exist in relation to that of South Asia that we've been discussing? Does it exist completely separated from Russia and the U.S.? How can we go forward with their potential?
A couple of quick points on a very complex subject. Israel doesn't really care too much about all this non-proliferation and disarmament talk. They see this as largely irrelevant to their security situation. Number two, Israel's substantial nuclear arsenal, estimated to be somewhere between 100 and 200 nuclear weapons, is largely irrelevant to their security situation. The threats they face are not ones that they can deter or solve with their nuclear arsenal. Number three, Israel's nuclear program has not been a driver for proliferation in the region. They've had nuclear weapons since 1968. There's been reaction from some states. You may say it's contributed to certain states' decisions to have chemical or biological weapons, but it hasn't really stimulated a nuclear program. The main driver for proliferation in the region has been the Iran programs, and now currently Iran. In the end, if you're going to convince Iran not to have a nuclear weapon, or other states in the region not to have a nuclear weapon, you've got to take the Israeli bomb out of the basement and put it on the table. It's got to be part of the long-range solution to this. There's really no way around it. A region with one nuclear state is an historic anomaly. Either there are several or there are none. And that's the way it has to go. So in the long run, that is the next several decades, Israel is going to have to be part of the effort to make the Middle East a zone free of nuclear weapons and the world free of nuclear weapons.
I could just add a couple of points to that. I agree with Joe that I've not seen any particularly strong evidence that the Israeli program was a driver of what the Iranians were doing. It was particularly driven by what was happening between them and Iraq. But I think we also have to keep in mind that what may not be a driver at one point can become a driver down the road. Iran was obviously preoccupied with Iraq as Iraq was invading the country, and Israel was not particularly high on their security agenda. That situation has changed. Right now, the region is much smaller, and Iran and Israel are, by all measurements, essentially neighbors, bordering neighbors. And as a result, the Israeli program, again, to agree with Joe, absolutely has to be on the table, needs to be addressed for several different reasons. First of all, as Joe pointed out, we have to do disarmament to have any credibility on non-proliferation. We already made, in my view, many mistakes. On the one hand, taking a position on the Iranian nuclear issue in which they have to, in which we're demanding that they don't have a right to enrichment, while at the same time making a nuclear deal with India that just makes the double standard so glaring and ridiculous that we really lose a lot of credibility. I think the Obama administration has done some good work by addressing the disarmament component of this. Secondly, in the question you asked, are there any linkages? There obviously are any linkages, and I think we should be very careful about any of this exceptionism that exists, which means that anything that happens in Israel is actually completely irrelevant to what happens in the rest of the region. It may not be direct, it may not be the primary driver, but Israel is a state in the region, and ultimately we're not going to be able to get a non-proliferation or any other type of solution unless it is a full player, not only in the solution, but also in the problem solving, but also as an understanding of to what extent that program or other activities over there are contributing to some of the difficulties in the region.
Great. Behind you, Jordan.
Thank you. Thank you. Dean Rust, retired State Department. It seems likely that the Republican nominee for president in 2012 is likely to be captured by the inside the Beltway view towards nuclear arms control, particularly when it comes to disarmament. So I wonder if you think that if a Republican is elected in 2012 and comes into office on 2013, that we're likely to see a complete return to 2001, or do you think that the extent to which Obama has sort of pushed the ball down the road on some of these things, and the fact that it's 12 years later might make whoever the Republican nominee is, if he or she becomes president, we might have a little bit more open attitude towards disarmament issues, thus help non-proliferation?
That is exactly why the Obama administration doesn't have a moment to lose. In my view, the Obama administration is seized with 2013-itis. All these tough issues that they have, whether it's Middle East peace or Iran or nuclear policy, they want to say, well, that's a 2013 problem. We'll take care of that down the road, right? There may not be a down the road. There may not be a down the road. So it's in your interest to lock these things in as much as possible, in large part because you have the military with you. It's not like Obama's doing this against the wishes of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or against, as I've described, the desire of the overall national security establishment in the United States. He has them with them. It's the Senate that's his problem right now. It's what's happened to GOP politics that is his problem right now. Push it. Push it. They're doing a guidance review now where they're trying to translate the nuclear posture review that they came out with last year into specific guidance for the U.S. military, targeting guidance. This will be done by the end of the year. This will determine how many weapons we need and for what purpose. Push this issue. This is probably his last best chance. Even with the second term, there's a tendency to sort of lock these things in. What Obama faces and what the next president will face is the drive to get your nuclear policy implemented over the nuclear bureaucracy, which is resistant to change, which likes things pretty much just the way they are. So if you're going to make change, you got to make the push now. One last point, and then I'll leave it. While we all talk about policy here, there is a huge budgetary component of this that has arisen. So even as we're having these policy struggles, we are also having these budget and debt and deficit debates. And the nuclear weapons budget of the United States is substantial. $54 billion a year currently, with new expenditures coming up for a new generation of bombers, missiles, and subs. If we do what we're planning to do, we're going to spend $700 billion on nuclear weapons over the next 10 years. That's as much as we spent in Iraq over the last 10 years. Can we afford that? Is that the strategic choice you want to make? That is a question for both Republicans and Democrats. You've got to come to grips with how much this stuff costs and how little security we actually get from it.
I think on that note, we're going to wind up. I mean, this was one of the more stimulating events I've ever hosted here, so I really want to thank our speakers.